We have an outstanding program for you today with a special group of speakers. It's not every day that one gets the opportunity to introduce our first two speakers. I'd like to take you back and borrow the words from an event that took place in April of 1998 at the White House. At that time, the acting director for the National Science Foundation, Neil Lane, was introducing one of our speakers for today. I quote, and this was in 1998, by the way. Over 2 decades ago, there was a lone member of Congress that was farsighted enough to see that our ability to harness the power and promise that leading-edge advances in technology would determine, in very large measure, our prosperity, our security, and our global influence, and with them, our standard of living, our quality of life for all our people in the 21st century. That strong voice was Vice President Al Gore. In fact, he is the one that coined the term the information highway. So we're very fortunate to have with us the former congressman, senator, and vice president of the United States, Mr. Al Gore, who also just happens to be a Nobel Peace Prize winner, a best-selling author, an environmentalist, and a pure champion for the internet and technology. The other person that I get the great honor to introduce is one of the architects and designers of the basic architecture and protocols of the original internet, a true pioneer, Mr. Vinton Cerf, who is also an awardee of a Presidential Medal of Freedom, an internet evangelist, and a friend to so many of you watching today. We had the honor of his company as a keynoter over a year ago at one of our big events. And of course, he remains the best-dressed techie in the world. To get us started, I would like to ask both of you one question, and then we'll enjoy a conversation between the two of you. At some point, you both met and started sharing and talking about your shared vision related to the foundation of the internet. Can you take us back to that conversation, to that first time or the first seed towards what then grew? Let's call it the germination point. Where were you? How did it go? Take us back to that moment. So without further ado, it is a privilege of a lifetime, but an absolute honor and privilege for me to welcome former Vice President Al Gore and internet evangelist Dr. Vint Cerf to open today's program. Take it away.
Well, thanks so much, Anna. What a pleasure to see you, Vice President Gore. This is a special treat since we don't see each other very often. Anna's presumption actually needs some refinement, and so I'm going to take you back to 1986. You will recall that you hosted a hearing as senator, and in the course of that hearing, Bob Cohn was present, and he brought up a term, the National Information Infrastructure. And as I recall, your reaction to that was to think about that as the information superhighway, partly, I think, because your father, the senior Al Gore, had introduced a defense act to create the interstate highway system. And I think you saw this as an analog to that in the digital world. But that led, I think, to the next step. You asked a question at the end of that hearing. You asked, at least according to Bob Cohn's rendering, whether it would make sense to build a fiber optic network to connect the supercomputers that NSF was sponsoring. And what is it that promoted that idea in your mind?
Well, thank you, Vint. And I want to acknowledge Anna Hunsinger, Vice President for Community Engagement for Internet 2, and to all of the other distinguished guests. And Vint, it's true that we don't get to see each other in person as much as we used to, particularly with the pandemic. But I'll say, Anna, Vint's not only the best dressed internet evangelist, but he also knows where the best restaurants in the world are too. And we've been making plans when we can get together again. But enough of that. Let me try to respond to your question, Vint. Actually, it goes back to something that you mentioned. I remember when I was a boy of 5 and 6 years old when my father, as a father myself, I later learned what my dad was doing. He had to keep me with him, and he took me to his hearings in the Senate. And he was chairman of the subcommittee that actually, and he wrote the legislation establishing the interstate highway system. It's often attributed to President Eisenhower, but I remember so vividly one of the lessons he taught me when we were driving on old Highway 70 from our farm in Carthage, Tennessee to Nashville, Tennessee. And it was in the evening, and he said, "Son, you see all of those tail lights stretching out in front of us and all of the headlights coming in the opposite direction. Why is this road so crowded now?" And he answered his own question by saying that after World War II, people began to buy so many cars and trucks that the old two-lane road network was no longer sufficient. And that's really one of the main motivations that caused him to propose the interstate highway system. And later, when I was a student in college, really focusing on information theory and policy in the government department, I ran across a law that didn't have a name yet, wasn't called a law. Gordon Moore had already noticed the doubling of the number of transistors that could be put on a chip and the exponential increase in the amount of information that was being processed locally in these larger and ever more powerful computers presented a gross mismatch with the equivalent of the two-lane roads, the twisted copper pair wires that had been put in place for voice communication, which doesn't require much bandwidth, could not connect the rich and highly productive activity conducted on supercomputers. But if they could be connected, then everything would change. And so it was a direct analogy. And the information superhighway meme, which I defended vigorously when people proposed Infobon, and I remember some of the other also rans or also drives. And you know, if you defend the language, then that's a handhold in gaining power over the concepts. And one of the other lessons that my dad taught me was that when the federal government put this interstate highway system in place, then local communities and states began to connect much larger access roads to the interstate highway system. So it was not really a difficult leap from the conceptual linkage between more capacity on the road networks for the much higher volume of traffic, because it was really a waste of productive energy to have these magnificent, ever more powerful computers that couldn't be used in combination. So yes, that's what led to that meme and led to the proposals that I advanced after that. And you and Bobby Kahn were my mentors in learning about the more detailed and significant facts that you knew that I had to learn from you. And what a joy it was to work with you, Vin. And may I say to others on this, if you want a friend who is loyal and always has your back, Vince Cerf is your guy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Vice President. Let me skip ahead a few years now, a couple of incidents and then a question. In 1988, the Federal Networking Council agreed to allow a commercial network service called MCI Mail to be connected to the NSFnet backbone, which was essentially breaking the permitted use, the appropriate use restrictions on the government backbones, which said no commercial traffic. So we sort of broke that barrier in 1988. And then in 1991, the National Science Foundation began an international connections program that allowed international connections to be made and underwritten by NSF, which spread the internet more fully to other parts of the world. And then in 1992, you may recall something that I think was called the Boucher Bill, which officially permitted commercial traffic to traverse the then US internet backbones, the NSFnet, the Energy Sciences Network, and the NASA Science Internet. So now you're on the cusp of becoming vice president at that point. And what I'm wondering about is, as you entered into that new role, what were your thoughts about the internet? You may remember some pretty important steps that you and President Clinton took, but I want you to go back to the early 1993 period. What's on your mind with regard to the NSFnet and the internet at that point?
Well, I was very steeped in it, Van, and partly because of my friendship with you and Bobby and others, and the hearings that I had. When I was in the House, actually, when I first joined the House, I began to have informal gatherings. I remember trying to persuade the then head of AT&T, when it was still Ma Bell, to support this idea of an information superhighway. And it was a wake-up call for me, because he didn't have zero interest. He had negative interest. This was a man named Charles Brown. The only business leader I could interest in this was the head of Corning Glass. Now, I wonder what he was thinking. They were, yeah. Corning was quite interested in it. And then I introduced legislation, and people have trouble remembering that there was a time when there was bipartisanship in the Congress. And I had help from Republicans, and the legislation that put $1 billion a year into the development of the switches and protocols and all of the changes that needed to be made in order to accommodate the linkage of these supercomputers. Initially, and it established the supercomputer centers around the world and a demonstration network. And NSFnet, of course, was before that NREN, the National Research and Education Network, was really intended to link all of the places that had these supercomputers. Of course, now an iPhone has more processing power than most all of them put together back in that day, but that's an old story. But what was in my mind, we had passed the legislation. The first President Bush, George H.W. Bush, had a science advisor named D. Allen Bromley. I tangled him on global warming policy and didn't get anywhere for reasons we don't need to go into. But he actually did respond to my efforts to persuade him, and through him, President Bush, on what became the internet. And we got that legislation passed. Actually, even though it had a lot of money and it was brand new, it passed unanimously with a bipartisan vote. I remember Newt Gingrich, before he became a hyper-partisan Speaker of the House, he and I were close friends and allies, and we've worked together episodically on a few things since then. But and I've never criticized him in spite of much provocation, because we were friends. But that was what was on my mind, to get this out there and begin seeing the advantages that would come from having this connection. And of course, we also included in the 90s, there was a problem of limited access in rural areas. And so we took the telecommunications fund that was originally designed to give farmers and rural communities telephone service and expanded it to include access to computer networks. And I remember the members of the other party began to call it the Gore tax, which they thought was going to be a devastating critique. But when it became so popular, the name Gore tax, much to my chagrin, disappeared from the lexicon.
We're going to run out of time, and I want to make sure to get one other question on the table. The NSFnet was retired in 1995, and it was replaced by a bunch of network access points, and it really promoted the commercialization of the internet. Then in 96, there was a revision of the Telecom Act, and I remember that there was another event that year, Net Day, and you and President Clinton rolled up your sleeves and you were pulling Ethernet in the schools. So I just to remind people of, how far we've come since then. Wi-Fi, of course, is widely available, but I'd like to ask you in the last 2 minutes that we have to speak a little bit about the role of internet, especially in the COVID pandemic, but also in this continued threat of climate change. What roles could it play? How can we help?
Well, thank you for asking. And of course, the pandemic, for all of the dark tragedies and policy failures, it has actually simultaneously accelerated many changes that were already underway. Even though you and I, Vint, have been using this technology for so long, I don't think I fully appreciated how much its use would expand when we had these lockdowns. It's incredible. I look back at the speeches I made way back in the day saying, one day even businesses will be connected to the internet. Even students will be connected. I had one story that I would always tell about a little girl in Carthage, Tennessee, population 2,000, coming home from school and connecting to the Library of Congress and getting access to all of the knowledge collected there. And so connecting the schools was really important. And now in this pandemic, we have seen an ability to use this magnificent technology in ways that were difficult to imagine before. And we are also seeing the dramatic advantages of the internet in dealing with the climate crisis. Just before this session, Vint, we were going back and forth on texting and email about it. I was speaking to a parliamentary gathering in London about the upcoming conference of the parties in Glasgow, and this was going to be canceled, but they said, hey, let's just do it on the internet. And so we had everybody's had that experience recently, and thank goodness we do have this capacity.
Thanks so much for joining us, Vice President Gore, and I look forward to another opportunity to get together again when it's safe. And in the meantime, amen to that. And in the meantime, I'll see you on the net.
All right. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks so much, Anna. Back to you.
Thank you, Vint and Mr. Gore. What an honor. Thank you for giving us a bit of your time today. And thank you so much for this very enlightening and fun session. I cannot help but reflect back again to that famous White House meeting in April 1998, where then NSF Director Neil Lane also famously said, as he introduced Mr. Gore, that the announcement about the development of the next generation computer network will dramatically underscore just how vital technological leadership is to the national interest of the United States. Mr. Lane could not have said it better. On behalf of the research and education community, I'd like to thank you both very much for being here today, and thank you for all that you have done in supporting innovation for our country, for the world, and for our communities across research and education. Next in our program, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Dennis Jennings. As the first program director for networking at the National Science Foundation from 1985 and 1986, Dr. Dennis Jennings was responsible for the design and development of the NSFnet program. Dr. Jennings developed a vision of an open network of networks, an internet, designed to serve all of the U.S. research and higher education community. Dr. Jennings' selection of the DARPA TCP/IP Internet Protocol Suite and his insistence on its deployment across NSFnet was a key and essential contribution to the development of the Internet. The NSFnet program stimulated the development of many regional research and education networks, and it connected them to campus networks, to supercomputing centers and their networks, and to the first interim NSF backbone, and later to the U.S. federal agency networks and to international research and education networks. NSFnet eventually became a major part of the Internet backbone. Please welcome Dr. Dennis Jennings.
Good evening, everybody, and greetings from Dublin, Ireland. Let me start by giving you some background to the NSFnet program. As you've heard, in the early 1980s, it became clear that US science and engineering researchers needed access to the world's largest and fastest computers, supercomputers, in order to explore the boundaries of knowledge in their discipline. In 1983-1984, in response to this need, the National Scientific Foundation, the NSF, set up the Office of Advanced Scientific Computing and allocated $500 million over 5 years for the NSF's National Supercomputer Program, $100 million a year. That was a lot of money back in 1984. In 1985 and 1986, 5 new national supercomputer centers were established in San Diego, Princeton, Cornell University, Illinois, and Pittsburgh University, joining the NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, in Boulder, Colorado, making 6 NSF supercomputer centers. But more importantly for our story, 10% of that $500 million, $10 million a year, was allocated to the Networking Access Program so that researchers could use the supercomputers from their home universities and research laboratories. I took up the position as Program Director for Networking on the 2nd of January 1985. I was on 15 months leave of absence from University College Dublin, and I was determined to try and get something done in that short period of time. My job at the NSF was to direct the development of the Supercomputer Access Network to support connectivity between US researchers and the NSF's national supercomputers. I was only a few weeks in the position when, later in January, at 20 minutes' notice, I was told I had to present my plans for the NSF's Science Board. So, with a few quick strokes of a marker pen on a plastic foil, I put up the following view graph, which I hope is now visible. There we go. On the overhead projector, and spoke for 20 minutes about my key initial ideas, which were, as Anna has outlined, an interconnected network of networks across the country, connecting individual researchers and their desktop workstation, illustrated by the campus network at the top of the model, to one another and to the national supercomputer centers, illustrated at the bottom. So rather than a set collection of individual isolated networks, this was a network of networks, a network of interconnected networks, or an internet. All networks running the then existing TCP/IP protocols to talk to one another and using the IP global addressing scheme, an internet-based NSFnet. The importance of the TCP/IP protocols, invented by Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn a decade earlier, and the fact that any network adopting these open standards could become part of the NSFnet network of networks, or internet, was emphasized to the meeting. And the presentation went reasonably well. So now we had a model for what we were trying to do, but the next decision was a really important one. And it was to make a subtle change in the overall mission. Rather than build a networking infrastructure for the existing and likely future supercomputers only, I proposed that the NSFnet Internet would be a general purpose academic research network, what today we would call an NREN, a National Research and Education Network, which not only provided access to supercomputers, both for existing and many potential new supercomputers, but also provided a general networking services infrastructure for all US academic researchers, not just the current select few. And the acceptance of this approach by the National Science Foundation was, in my view, truly visionary. The next thing was, well, okay, so what might this look like? My model was a 3-level network model, comprised of, at the lowest level, campus networks, effectively delegating to the campuses the responsibility for and cost of connecting the researchers to the NSFnet. And these were not funded by the NSF. Mid-level networks, or at least not by the NSFnet program, mid-level networks of a variety of types to connect the campuses together, and very importantly, to leverage, as you would say, the university, regional, and state's interest in networking to support research, often industrial research, and to add additional funding sources for the networks. And the regional networks received only partial funding from the NSFnet program. And finally, the top component was a national backbone network to connect the supercomputers together and the mid-level networks. And the backbone was to be NSF funded. All networks involved in this mandated to run the TCP/IP internet protocols and to use IP addressing. The regional network idea stimulated great interest across the country. And by the end of 1985, let me move to the next slide, most of the regional networks listed on this slide had been or were being formed and had submitted or were preparing proposals for NSFnet funding. And lastly, the national backbone. On the 16th of September 1985, at a routine Supercomputer Center's review meeting held at the NCAR Center, the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, I proposed an interim 56 kb backbone network connecting the supercomputer centers together and managed by the centers themselves. Interim because I would really have liked to have had a T1 1.5 megabit network, but the budget that year wouldn't stretch to it. This was not, of course, the first time I had talked about this, but it was the first time that the center directors had been asked to take responsibility for such a backbone network. To my great disappointment, the proposal was summarily rejected. But not to be put off, I spent most of my time over dinner that evening and over breakfast the following morning talking to individual supercomputer center directors about the benefits to them of such a backbone network and the opportunity for their center to serve not their local supercomputing community, but all supercomputer users across the US. When we reconvened on the 17th of September, the agenda was swept aside, and the directors, probably, I think, if memory serves, led by Ken Wilson, Nobel laureate and director of the Cornell Theory Center, demanded that action be taken as soon as possible to deliver the NSFnet backbone network. I had persuaded them. So we all adjourned, and a number of us found a picnic table outside the NCAR, the cafeteria, and we sketched our ideas for the NSFnet interim backbone. And after a while, at about 9:30 that morning, I took out my pencil and I sketched my version of what we had discussed, as you see in this slide, on a normal office pad. The sketch is supposed to be the United States, and there's where the centers were and the links between them. And this was agreed. And so the 3-level model of the NSFnet, a network of networks, an internet of interconnected networks running the TCP/IP protocols, was agreed. Okay, so what was apart from making these decisions, and they were key decisions, What was my role in all this? Well, I spent my time traveling across the US, visiting campuses, telling people about the supercomputer program, telling them about the networking program, the NSFnet program, and encouraging them to get together with other institutions and to make proposals for their own regional network and for support from NSFnet. The overall result, and I think this is really key to the success, the overall success was a community-based and community-supported effort. From today's perspective, all of these decisions may come across as kind of obvious, in fact, rather trivial. But back in 1985, the internet idea was radical and controversial as far as the majority of the science and engineering community were concerned, as these protocols were not widely used by them. In some cases, I remember the rows, the approach was bitterly fought over, but mostly it was enthusiastically embraced. It is, of course, only with hindsight that it's possible to present these decisions in this clear, unambiguous form. In reality, there was great uncertainty and lots of back and forth discussions as these decisions emerged. Later on in 1985, at the end of 1985, I was asked to write an article for Science. There's the cover page of the reprint, which was an important step in publicizing what was going on. That article was a survey article of what was going on in networking. It couldn't, unfortunately, tell people about the regional networks because the awards of funding to those networks had not been announced at the time I was writing the article, and I couldn't compromise decisions that hadn't yet been made. But the article did include some vision statements. Our vision of this network is of a vast network of networks interconnecting the scientist's local advanced graphics workstation environment to other resources. And through that window, researchers may gain access to the required computing and communications and data and information resources and access colleagues throughout the world. This vision statement resonates to this day. A statement that is especially relevant to this year of 2020, when, without any advance notice or preparation, the internet, the same internet that started back in 1985, supported the rapid movement of tens, if not hundreds of millions of people to online working using internet-based desktop video conferencing facilities, and also to allow them to do online shopping and many more things. But back to 1985-86, eventually I ran out of time. I had hoped to start the work on the solicitation for the next NSFnet backbone, the 1.5 megabit one, but my time ran out. We can look very quickly at that backbone that was developed by a consortium of MCI, Merit, and IBM under the direction of Steve Wolf, my successor, who really is one of the great heroes of the NSFnet program. And here's a diagram showing traffic. That wasn't the end of the NSF's involvement. As we've heard earlier, many more networks were developed and brought into service after the NSFnet backbone was actually shut down in 1995. And lastly, let me tell you that I thought this was what we were doing was going to be effective. We realized at the end of my tenure there, and I had to go home, was that the NSFnet was started. It was not finished by any means, but it was started. And I thought it was well started. And shortly after that, and even today, I sign all my emails with the tagline, "I told you this internet thing would catch on. I told you this internet thing would catch on." Thank you.
So I want to thank again all our speakers today. And now we're going to have a little bit of fun and bring all our speakers together for a short panel session. I know there are so many questions we want to ask all of them. And unfortunately, we're not going to have time to cover all of them, but we'll do our best to get to some great questions that were submitted prior to the event. And we'll do our best to get all of the other questions answered after the event if we can. So the plan for now is that I am going to be first asking each of the panelists to take a couple of minutes to address a specific question to them. And then we're going to have a little fun and go around the panel with a question for that we will share with all of you. And let's get started with Margaret. And let's see. Some scientific impacts come from attempts to scratch an itch. Others evolve more by chance rather than intentionally. So where the impactful value of an idea sometimes only emerges years or decades after the idea or the technique itself is proposed. What ideas and opportunities might there be today that could have the impact 30 years from now that NSF has had? Recognizing that prediction, of course, is hard, especially about the future. Just to paraphrase Yogi Berra. And how can NSF help increase the likelihood of that impact?
Wonderful question. And obviously the talk I gave just tried to paint parts of that picture. NSF's funding supports core research across all scientific topics. We were founded 70 years ago with that as our mission, to be the nation's basic science and all of science research agency. And within size, about 2/3 of our $1 billion a year budget goes to core research programs. So basically good ideas that percolate out of the community, out of individual or small groups of researchers. In addition, good ideas are only, and maybe increasingly, good ideas are only a piece of the puzzle. And we need to make sure that all scientists have access to the data and the resources they need to advance their ideas. And that's where the notion of data repositories and compute resources becomes so important, with the goal being that everyone with a good idea can also find the data, the storage, the software, and the hardware resources to move forward on that idea. In terms of topics, if you want me to pick a winner topic, I'm not going there per se. But I will say that the National Academies just last week released their newest update to the so-called Tire Tracks report that many of us might be familiar with. I would strongly encourage all the listeners to check it out. One of the things that it shows both graphically and through the text is the long-term resurgence of topics until they reach impact. And the sort of familiar version example of this is AI, right, with its different summers and winters. But there are other examples that particular diagram, that particular report draws out. For example, the notion of formal methods, which worked for literally decades, getting to the point where now SAT and SMT solvers can be key parts of verifying the security and the reliability of different hardware and software systems. But it took formal methods a while to get to that. That's another decades-long patient investment over time. So resurgence is one thing from the report. The other thing I would note is the degree of confluence, that it's, in many cases, it's about pulling together ideas from different research areas and advancing on them. AI, quantum are all examples where the notion of confluence and the notion of sort of patient investments over time are going to clearly be important going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to take some liberties as the MC and ask the next question for both Dennis and Vint. Let me start by saying, Dennis, you talked about how 35 years ago, there was uncertainty. You also have this memorable quote, "I knew this internet thing would catch on." Okay. As the NSFnet was being created, is there a defining moment in time you can point to that says, if this one thing had not happened, we may not know the internet as we know it today? I like to also ask Mr. Vint, sir, to take that question wherever he wants to. I would ask, we know when we heard TCP/IP was instrumental. So maybe if you want to emphasize that, but was there something else also? And again, the defining moment that if that one thing had not happened, we may not know the internet as we know it today. Dennis? There we go. That was a little bit. Well, what we could do is, while we get the microphone back on, Vint, would you like to get us started with this question?
No, I can certainly try. Am I audible, first of all? It's an important question. Now, whether I make sense is a different question. I understand that. Let me start out by observing that NSF got involved in internet ideas before NSFnet, and the Computer Science Net, or CSNet, started around 1980-81. Discussions were ongoing, and I remember Bob Kahn and Larry Landweber had a conversation, and Bob said, "Why don't you talk to Vint about TCP/IP?" So that NSF had already begun to get some interest in this, and a very successful CSNet was implemented. The second thing is that there were other agencies in the US government that also got into this, and I'm going to have to rely on Dennis to see whether I have the timing right, because the NASA Science Internet and the Energy Sciences Network from NASA and from the Department of Energy were being built in parallel and in replacement of earlier networks. For example, there was a high-performance physics network, HEPNet, a high-energy physics network, that was based on Digital Equipment Corporation's DECnet. And that was a DOE activity. If I remember right, NASA was also using digital equipment. And so there was quite a tussle over whether to stick with the DECnet path or whether to switch over to this TCP/IP thing. And digital was going in the OSI direction. So there was quite a bit of tension in those 1980s periods over which direction to go. There were government policies that required everybody to use OSI because that was being established by an international standards organization. And who is this? What is this IETF thing? It's just part of the Defense Department, and who wants to use that? So there was a lot of tension there. I think, though, that one of the key implementation practices for TCP/IP was the implementation of that protocol for Unix operating system. It was done at Berkeley, and it was released as BSD 4.2. And that was made available free of charge. DARPA paid for that. And on that, plus the introduction in the early 1980s of Ethernet, and then the Sun Microsystems workstations, which adopted the use of TCP/IP in part because of the Berkeley Unix implementation. All of that was going on sort of in parallel. And so although I'm not sure that we would have seen quite the same rapid evolution of the internet had Dennis not made his decision, there was an ongoing initiative using these protocols, but I think the NSFnet decision really accelerated that. In particular, the multi-network architecture that was chosen for NSFnet backbone, plus the intermediate level networks, instantly demonstrated the feasibility of a multi-network, very distributed environment. Do we have audio back now from Dennis?
I have audio. The technical background people have been working frantically to fix me, and I managed to get my earphones and Bluetooth and everything confused. So much for the technology. But I was just about to answer the question, Anna, because there were a couple of things that come to mind. I think Vint is right that in the long term, the obvious open systems, the open nature of the TCP/IP protocols, the network of network concepts, the availability in the computer science world would have brought the internet into fruition. But it might have been a long time. So for example, had the OSI protocols been more advanced, because one of my things was that I said, yeah, OSI, fine. When these international standards do emerge, when they do really exist, and they didn't in 1985, and when in particular they provide connectionless services and they work and are available, then in about 5 years' time, we'll consider it. Of course, that never happened. I mean, ISO International Standards, OSI, was a complete cluster blank. It really was, and I was involved in it on the European side, but I won't go there. The specific question, when I suppose if there were a different program director hired at that time, things might have been different. I had a background in networking. I knew that Larry Landweber and Ira Fuchs were the people who encouraged me to come to the US. So I was steeped in the idea of open networking and TCP/IP and so on. Another program director might not have been. And there was significant pressure to be pragmatic. Look, Dennis, I know this network of networks, but if we have this network here and that network there and this network there, isn't that a network of networks? No, that's not a network of networks. So they're a different type of program director, and program directors have enormous autonomy. I mean, I did stuff that I didn't have to ask anyone's permission for, because I thought it was the right thing and I thought it was my job. A different program director might have done differently. And a very specific, about a week before I left at the end of my 15 months, I went up to Princeton to the John von Neumann Center to talk to them. And I learned, to my horror and shock, they were planning to run DECnet on the JVNC network. Now, the JVNC network it was a T1 network. It really was the backbone, while the little 56 KB backbone was kind of weak. It was really important to the NSFnet program. But the engineers they brought in from ETA, the supercomputing people, knew DECnet. They liked DECnet. They knew nothing about TCP/IP, so they were going to run DECnet. And I said, you can't do that. And they said, well, why not? I said, because that fellow in the NSF has said it has to be TCP/IP. If it's part of the NSFnet program and it's been funded by NSFnet, it has to be TCP/IP. So, but for that tiny little happenstance, the effort might simply have not worked.
Wow.
Wow. Thank you. That's not serendipitous, but que sera, sera, as some people may say. That's great. Let's take now to Andrew. The Internet Society has considerable resources at its disposal. Can you describe how you hope to use those resources in the coming decades to champion the things that we love about the Internet? And you can expand on those things that we don't love about the Internet, but let's be positive, very positive today, too. But what can you share with us that we can hold ISOC to account for in the coming decades?
Well, there are a couple of straightforward things that I can point out. The first one is that today, in fact, we released our plans for next year. So our annual plan that's up on the website. And so, those are the kinds of things that you can hold us to account for right away. We've also made a significant announcement recently about relatively long-term funding for the Internet Engineering Task Force in order to make sure that the IETF is there over the long haul. And there's a matching program involved there so that, as the IETF expands its own fundraising capabilities, they get some money from the Internet Society as well in order to make sure that they're on a solid footing over the long run. But there's another piece to this that I think is important, and it was just very nicely illustrated both by Vint and Dennis, in that, the sort of engineering decisions are and deployment decisions are kind of bound up with one another in important ways a lot of the time. That it's not just enough to sort of say, oh, well, now we've invented this protocol or now we've done the science or whatever. You also have to, get things deployed, get things in the field. And the reality is that it's still the case, despite all of the celebration that we're having today, it is still the case that nearly half of the world's population doesn't have access to this marvelous tool. And that's wrong. It's just wrong. And it's one of the things that we are, passionately committed to. We're working with others in order to improve access. We're working with governments and regulators in order to make the regulatory environment easy so that different mechanisms will work. We're working with all sorts of different approaches to connectivity, because the sort of standard approaches that we've taken to everything, they've worked well for half the world, and we've got to figure out how to connect everybody else. And as that is successful, it's not enough just to connect people. It's not enough to sort of drop the internet on people. They need to know what to do with it, how to work with it, how to use it, how to take advantage of the opportunities that it presents. It's not enough to go into a country and say, poof, now you've interneted. You really have to give people the tools and the ability and the skills in order to do those things. And I think that is one of the critical things that we're investing in, to try to make sure that everybody in the world can use the tools to the advantage of themselves and not to the advantages of a few who already have plenty.
Thank you, Andrew. Let's seg now to Howard. Internet 2 owes a lot to its creation, to all that happened 35 years ago. And then came the internet. Today, Internet 2, our name includes the internet, and we're still called Internet 2. So as the NREN for the United States, can you share with the audience what's next for Internet 2? What are you most excited about that you want to share with us today?
Well, I won't take the bait either. I won't pick favorites. I'm excited about all the things that we're doing. I think many things that I mentioned. But I will say one of the things I'm sort of very excited about is for taking a more holistic approach, is how do we use all our capabilities to help scale and accelerate research and education collaborations across the community. And this year has certainly shown how important those collaborations are, maybe more so than ever before. And so, but in the context of this event, talking about scientific collaborations, we're certainly in a much different place than where we were back then with 5 national centers. As we talked about, data analytics, this growing ecosystem of computational ecosystems, much more heterogeneous than we saw that with ECAS. Researchers using specific elements like FPGAs in a commercial cloud, and GPUs in another one, to optimize parts of an existing scientific workflow to get an overall improvement. Composing that, has been a real focus. I think that, that there's a huge value in that, huge opportunity, but it also comes along with a lot of engineering and technical challenges. It's more complex, many more things to put together. Technology changes at an extreme rate. And, there's still a lot of manual effort in putting in a complete end-to-end solution for across the board. And the days of a single researcher understanding the whole system end-to-end are long gone. There's so many different moving parts. So, I think for us, what's next is much more of a focus when it comes to the networking piece on the software elements of the networking, and really tying that together with the trust model so that we can make the idea of a national, research cloud as frictionless as possible, and making it much easier for people to do it. I think that's also part of the democratization part. Following the theme here is, if you're going to make the infrastructure much more available to researchers and many more researchers, you also have to make it easier for people to use to get the effect out of it. I think one of the advantages that the RNA network community has is this unique spirit of collaboration that we have. If you're really trying to do things edge to edge, there's things that the RNA network community can do between campuses, regionals, national, NRANs, international NRANs, government agency networks that we can do end to end, because we have that shared mission that doing, maybe in a more traditional networking world would be difficult to achieve.
Thank you.
Just said. That end-to-end notion also drives the importance of transporter data flow and the freedom of movement of traffic back and forth to accelerate research. And the other thing is that the International Connections Program and the relationships among the various national research and education networks that NSF funds has been super helpful, not only in getting these large-scale high-performance networks linked to each other, but what's interesting is that they also extend outward from the universities where those the nexus is into the local population. And so we're starting to see organizations like the Network Startup Resource Center, which is also funded by NSF, reaching out to schools, which right now are isolated because of the pandemic. And so the existence of the NRENs is actually creating a new opportunity to extend access.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Vince. And thanks for the call out to our colleagues at NSRC and the great work that they're doing as well for global democratization and access to the internet. And speaking of the internet, so you all touched on this, and I wish I didn't have to bring it up, but we live in a global pandemic today. And all the work that you've all been talking about have enabled us now with the internet to continue some level of functioning during a very difficult time for our societies. The internet has become a key to economic survival and communications in a world without face-to-face interactions. Can you expand a little bit more on the things that you would like to bring up in terms of the advances that have allowed this capability? Feel free to also talk about additional challenges that you would like to call out that have surfaced, or what lessons have we learned over the last couple of months or last several months that will drive future research and innovation? I'm going to ask each of you, and let's go in the same order as I ask you the questions. Take 1 minute, if you can, to answer that question. But Margaret, I made you go first, so I will give you an out if you want to go last, too. So what would you prefer? Would you want to go first?
I think I'm happy to go first before all the good ideas are taken, right? So I'm going to leave all the networking stuff for the networking experts. I'm going to talk about processors and graphics, right? So the fact that we are able to be here today is in part based on networking and bandwidth, but it's also based on graphics processors that are keeping up with us as we speak. It's based on natural language processing that's able to do a half-decent job of captioning this so that a broad set of people can view this in an accessible way. So I'll stay there. NLP and processors and graphics processors, and I'll leave the rest for the other four. Thanks.
Thank you. Who would like to go next?
It's Vin again. Look, 3 words: drive cost out. The only way that we're going to make this system accessible to everybody is if we make it affordable at the capacities that make it useful, as we are seeing right now. So driving cost out is super important. There are policy issues there. There are technology issues there. There are business model issues there, all of which will contribute to getting the other half of the world up and running in a useful way.
Dennis.
I think we've seen a glimpse of a possible future that is interesting and appealing, and that is using technology to make the isolated farmhouse in rural Ireland as central to the activities, economic and social, as an apartment in the middle of the city of Dublin, where I'm in at the moment. It's going to need a lot more technology, a lot more computing power, a lot more realism in the interactions, so that we can all interact. But it would also eliminate a lot of the bottlenecks in cities. It would eliminate a lot of the commute. People are now spending 2 hours getting to work and 2 hours getting home on top of a 7.5-hour day or whatever it is. That's an awful nightmare for the civilized world. And for the rest of the world, which isn't based on cities or small rural populations, as Andrew pointed out, they don't have access to this technology. So somewhere in there is a glimmer of a continuation of this change into a much more equal world that doesn't have burning fossil fuels to get to work and burning half our waking lives to go and come back from work. And that, I think, is an idea that should inspire us.
Okay.
I'll go. I think, I'm guilty as anybody, to take a network-centric view of things and talk about how, the network only covers half the people on the planet. But I think we also have to consider that, probably more than that don't have devices to actually use the network. And I think if you're going to, we have to consider the full, solution for allowing people to interact, collaborate, and take advantage of the amazing compute and technology infrastructure that we have, including the training elements that come along with that. I think we're just, the network is certainly an important piece, but it's not the only piece.
Andrew.
Well, I will say that I am, desperately looking forward to the period in which I can get a haircut over the internet. But quite apart from that, I think that we have the fundamental reality that we've been taught here is the ways in which we can adapt. We are tool using creatures, humans are, and it means that we've got this tool, and we don't know what people are going to do with it. And I think that preserving that flexibility of this technology is one of the things that I think we're really going to have to concentrate on, because it's very tempting to say, okay, well, we know what this thing's for now, and we're going to set it up so that that's what we can do with it. I think we need to make sure that as the other half of the world comes online, they're going to notice that we can do interesting things with it. Let's make sure that they have those opportunities.
Great. Thank you. I know we're a little past time, but I'm going to ask you to just stay for a few more minutes to just take one more question that I think is really important. Let me ask the question and then see if each of you would want to take less than a minute to answer this one. If you look back to the younger version of yourself 35 years ago, when you were setting out to change the world, knowing what you've learned and knowing what you know now, what advice would you give to the younger generation of professionals today?
Oh, wow.
Let's start with you, Dan.
From my perspective, if I'd known where we'd end up when I started NSFnet, I probably would have been frozen in the headlights. I would have had to think about, well, what about a scalable network that covers all the world? Not just for research, but for commerce. What about security? What about bad actors? What about this? It would be overwhelming. But I was fortunate enough to be dealing with a small community and some simple ideas and to stick to those. So what advice would I give? Don't overthink it. Get some good stuff done. And then let's see what happens. Would be my advice.
Great. Thank you. Howard, would you like to go next?
Sure. Well, first of all, 35 years ago, I wasn't that young. But with that context, the first thing I think I'd tell people is go out and go change the world. Right? I think that's a critical part of if you're going to spend a good part of your life doing something, do something, that you're going to have an impact, and everybody can have an impact. I think the other thing is, don't worry about failure. Don't worry about making mistakes. That is, usually in the long run, your best friend. Short term may be painful, but, take chances, and don't think too far in the future of what it's all going to mean. Don't worry about, people always say, go outside your comfort zone. For me, that's easy. I'm never comfortable, so I'm always outside my comfort zone. But, do things that, that are unexpected, especially when you're younger and you have that time. That's what I've got advice to give you.
Thank you. Margaret.
My advice would be, we need you. We need all of you. I think our field sometimes gives the impression that you have to have been playing with this technology from preschool to the present in order to be eligible to come in the door. And I think that's a problem. We need everyone. because it's through that broad diversity of ideas that we're going to tackle those next themes that all of us mentioned about the way that computers touch humanity. We can't do that without pulling in a broader cross-section of humanity to work on those challenges. So we need you all. Thanks.
Andrew.
Well, I mean, that's a great segue because 35 years ago, I still thought I was going to be a philosophy professor. And look what happened. I think it's actually really important to recognize that the perspectives that different people bring to this, to this effort is exactly what brings us new ideas to it. And without those injections of things that you weren't expecting, you're not going to get the advantages, whether it's the thing that you're not going to be expecting because, as Dennis described, you managed to buttonhole enough people at the conference so that you convinced them that actually the network was a good idea, or whether it's because, you know, you get this sort of kismet where you discover that somebody's going to deploy DECnet and that's a bad idea, or whatever it is. Those opportunities are something that we need to be prepared to do, and for that, we have to have lots of people.
Great. Vent.
So several things. First of all, young people are usually too young to know you can't do that, and so I encourage them to go try anyway. Second, if you're young, take the risky road because you're young enough to recover from all this stuff. And I guess the final observation, which might be in some distinction to what Howard said, you don't have to go out to change the world. Just go out and do something. You'll be surprised what happens if it works.
Wonderful.
Thank you for joining us for the 25th anniversary of the commercial internet. We have with us today 6 experts that were essentially there for most of that part. I don't want to date anybody, but we're all essentially gray hairs at this point. We held this effort, this celebration back in 2015. So today we're going to sort of talk about, compare and contrast our 2015 celebration and try to capture some lessons learned from the whole 25 years and develop what maybe could be helpful going forward. For starting point, we wanted to raise the awareness about the moment of the commercialization of the internet on April 30th, 1995, what we're calling Internet Independence Day. Netscape went public 3 months later, and that's kind of what most people think is sort of the launch of the internet. But 3 months before that, the NSFnet backbone was decommissioned and the commercial internet was on its way. I also want to mention John Perry Barlow, who was around at the time in 2015. He's not with us at this point to celebrate the 25th anniversary. And he was, of course, an important figure in the development of the internet. I posted a video I did of him around 2015 where he can kind of speak for himself at this point. And you can find that at danielberninger.com/Barlow. Tom, do you want to just get us started and just sort of give us some of your ideas, a little bit about your background and what you're seeing today?
And go off mute. Tom, go off mute.
I was just going to say how comfortable we've all become with Zoom. Thank you, Lester. Zoom at least tells you when you're talking on mute. I should mention, now, for those of us who are Asperger enabled, Zoom's a great thing because in a real meeting, people's names aren't below them. And so you never can use people's names because you're forgetting them when you're talking to them. So Zoom in some ways is better than having a real meeting. My background doesn't matter too much because this time is so different from what's been before. I was at Microsoft before Internet Freedom Day, and I remember Bill Gates saying if there were 2 buttons under this desk and one of them would blow up the internet, I'd push it. And that was Bill's recognition of how disruptive the internet was going to be. It blew up this whole great competition that was going to be between Exchange and Lotus Notes, and made us much less relevant than we all thought we were going to be. It taught us that information, not only technology, but information is distributed, that hierarchical organization of information, which we believed was everything, was not very important at all. Horizontal links were much more important than vertical links. That changed the way that organizations work, and organizations have become much less hierarchical, much more horizontal. And I think in general, that's been a good thing. But let's look at where we are now, because I think we're in the middle of a discontinuity, and obviously unpleasant discontinuity. It's not a black hole because we can still remember the past, and I think we can talk a little bit about the future, but it is a discontinuity. And virus aside, I think this continuity has been building. There's been a breakdown in polity. There's been a great polarization, which I think is a bad thing, period. Whether you love Trump or hate him, it's a symbol and a symptom of that polarization, but it predates him as well. And so we were starting to break along a lot of seams, or were rupturing at a lot of seams, even before COVID-19 brought it all into sort of a terrible focus. Our internet, which has sometimes played a role in bringing people together, has also played a role in pushing people apart. That we'll remember when we were kids, and there were first these news nets and online forums, and if you were a nerd, you could be a sysop. And remember the flaming then. Well, that flaming that used to be between little boys, pretty much, Esther, you're probably innocent of that, has expanded worldwide. We did that with the internet, and that's not really a good thing. That tone doesn't scale very well, and that tone hasn't been helpful. But the first thing that the discontinuities taught me is humility. It was just less than a year or so ago, where people were saying, well, we have to have a guaranteed minimum wage because basically we don't need all those people who don't write programs or do other kinds of engineering stuff. Well, who's the essential worker now? It is the person who flips the burgers and hauls the trash and stocks the shelves. They're essential. I'm not sure, even if we couldn't all work from home, I'm not sure anybody'd miss us for a couple of months. But there are people that we found now are really very, very essential. And
You're on mute again.
Yeah. Comes a much greater respect for what those people are doing. I remember people using terms like cyber serfs and cyber lords. Well, if it weren't for the cyber serfs, then we'd be very hungry right now. So this has, I hope this has taught us the humility that'll help us going forward. We always knew how much we need the medical workers, but we were pretty scornful of the other people, and that was wrong, and we've learned. Second thing from inside the discontinuity I see is alarm. This virus happens to be a virus that people have, and that's been very disruptive. The internet could have this virus too. Like society, it's become very globalized. Its original design, brilliant design, was to be decentralized, but many of its resources have become more centralized. Fortunately, not having an internet breakdown at the same time we're having so many other breakdowns, but I think we could. And I think that's something we have to think of going forward. I think we've lost the lesson that Vint Cerf taught us of decentralization, and we have to find other ways to decentralize the internet. It's now woven into our society, woven into our logistics, and all of those, it turns out, have been over-optimized. The theory, the reason the dinosaurs so easily is they had adapted extremely well to climate it was exactly at the time they were there. And then it didn't take much of a change to push them over the brink. And we adapted too well, I think, in optimizing our supply lines to get the last bit of cost out of them, optimized at the expense of resiliency, optimized some at the expense of
Hey,
the
Tom,
ability.
we're losing you a little bit on the bandwidth according to the platform. And so I'm going to take a break and let Jeff Jarvis tell us about his life, and we'll see if
Great.
your bandwidth picks up a little bit. But it kind of is fitting for what you were just saying. So
Yeah, and
we got
also
most of it.
points out we haven't solved the problem of good internet in rural areas and how important that is.
Yeah, you were making that example just to show us as a demonstration. So Jeff, Jeff Jarvis, you take your mute off and go ahead and just kind of tell us about your life right now. And I assume obviously you didn't expect to be stuck in your home, but also just tell us a little about how you got here and what you would like us to know going forward.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here. I was a last-minute substitute. I'm not worthy of being here, but I'm delighted to be in this company that gave us the great internet. I'm a professor at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at City University of New York. I'm calling you from New Jersey, about 2 miles where Tom Ebslin's office was when he turned off the clock on the internet and made it explode. And I'm grateful to him to this day for having done that. And I'm grateful today for the internet. To imagine what we would be going through right now without the net, without being able to work and teach and order from home, without being able to connect with people as we're social distancing from them, is awe-inspiring, I think. And I think that we were going through a period of techlash, but I think the techlash right now is on hiatus because people want to love the internet again. They're even liking Facebook again for a while at least. And I think that we're seeing that the ability of the internet now is, or the issue of the internet is no longer primarily to try to tamp down disinformation and bad guys and Russian bots. Now the need we have is to amplify expertise. And I started a COVID Twitter list, which you can find at bit.ly/COVID Twitter list, with almost 600 epidemiologists and virologists and infectious disease doctors. And it is phenomenal to watch them in their open information ecosystem of preprints and the internet to create an entirely new structure of peer review. And peer review has been around since Cicero and been around since the 17th century science journals. But they've reinvented it because they have new possibilities, because the internet gave them the opportunity in this crisis to share information. 6,000 papers, I think, last I saw, written so far about COVID, and they can judge this. My biggest lesson, I think, of late has been, because I come here as a media guy, having been on newspapers and magazines and now teaching journalism. So I think we in media tend to see the world in our own image, godlike. And so we think that there's a thing called media and the internet's inside. There's a print bubble and a broadcast bubble and an internet bubble. And I've come to see how completely wrong that is. That the internet is not a subset of media. Media are clearly a subset of the internet along with every other sector. And right now we're seeing those sectors being dragged into the black hole gravity of the internet with greater speed. Social was born in there. Communications is entirely in there. Finance is moving in there. Education is being dragged in there fast. Media is coming in there. Crime, government, and so on. And so I think it's a misnomer in my world to teach and study media. We've got to teach and study the greater set, which is the net that the folks here helped create. And I think then how do we look at this beast? What is it? How do I define it? I've come to see the internet as a connection machine, connecting people with information, people with people, information with information, and machines with machines. And in that, I call upon James Carey, who was a Columbia University professor who talked about society and democracy as conversation. And so to me, the internet is primarily conversation and the society is conversation. And we are just figuring it out. So the last thing I want to say is this. I have a very long-term timeline in my view of this. I'm trying to write a book right now and get any head around this on the end of the Gutenberg age. And if you go back to 1450, it took 150 years before the first newspaper was created in about 1605, or in 1605. It took another 2 centuries before major technological innovations came along in the form of the steel press and stereotyping and steam power. Advanced to the telegraph and wood pulp paper, advanced to broadcast starting about 1900, advanced to TV, and then advanced to today. Of course, what I left out in that sequence was the internet, only 25 years ago, which is to say that it's now 1475 in Gutenberg years. And we still don't know what the internet is yet. It is still young. We're still figuring out what it is. We're still seeing the future in the analog of the past. And we haven't fully yet understood what the capabilities and possibilities of the net are. And so I'm too old to know how this is going to turn out. My students may even be too old. But I think that one thing that this discontinuity, as Tom said, is going to force upon us is the death of some industries, the death of some institutions, profound challenges of institutions and industries, and the opportunity to invent new things, to see new sprouts out of the ashes.
Great, thanks. And I think that's a good setup for James Lewis' experience. James is at CSIS, and he's had a very exciting year. What Jeff is talking about is essentially the experience of human beings of the internet over time. And at the end of the day, whatever happens, the human beings are still here. So we could be evacuated from all the public spaces, but we still end up in the private spaces. And a lot of the excitement in the last year has been the reaction of nation states about the promise and potential of the internet, and that's James's world. Jim, do you want to maybe even just at the moment the sort of the optimistic sentiment of the commercial internet in terms of somebody? I think some military people said, yeah, go ahead, let it go commercial.
And that turned out to be a good thing. So I thought what I'd do is just talk about maybe a couple trends that we saw 25 years ago and turned out to be good indicators. So that's one thing we can do in this exercise, is look for those trends. So when I started doing this, Europe had a tech industry, right? But they got their data rules wrong. And here we are. If you look 25 years ago, a little less, the Chinese began building an architecture of surveillance. And at that point, I remember thinking, oh, that's cute. It's blossomed, right? So the architecture of surveillance is now spreading around the world. Somebody said, you probably all remember who, in 1999, you have no privacy, get over it. And at the time I thought, oh, that's outrageous. Of course I have privacy. If I had privacy then, I got much less now. And I don't know if I care. So one of the big changes is that the world has discovered the internet. And I have been working at the UN. We're on hold, not surprisingly. But you've got a couple things that are indicators. You had the Secretary General create something called the high-level panel, which was, the typical, the UN always does things as if it was Noah's Ark, so they get 2 of each flavor. But the high-level panel was interesting because they came to some conclusions that in some ways I think were wrong. One of the conclusions was, well, this is a space that needs more governance. It needs more of a rule for the UN. We should probably talk about that before we move much further. I've been participating in something called the Open-Ended Working Group on Information Security. And the fascinating thing there is that it's open to all member states, right? And at the first meeting, 140 countries showed up. That's incredible. That almost never happens. And of those 140 countries, 80 of them spoke. And when you saw people from Africa and from Latin America and from Asia and from all over the world being incredibly articulate about their concerns about the internet, the world has discovered this thing and they're beginning to try and wrestle with it. So maybe we could say, what are some trends that we ought to be watching for? The first one, I'm going to call it the assertion of sovereignty. So governments have discovered the internet, countries have discovered the internet, and they say, how do I protect the interest of my citizens in security, in data, in everything else? And there's a limit to what they can do because, of course, it's a global infrastructure. They're bound by economics. Sometimes people talk about the fragmenting of the internet. I don't think that's going to happen because nobody wants to cut themselves off from what's essentially the wellspring of economic growth. We have a problem where we have a global infrastructure, but it's subject to national rules. And this is largely what places like the UN and some other foreigner forums are wrestling with, the IGF, for example. How do we create rules that make everyone happy? That's another process that we may not live to see the end of. It might accelerate, but you have this transborder technology. It's fabulous. Everyone loves it, but it makes people nervous. And that's one thing I've seen. I wouldn't say we don't have any privacy, get over it. I'd say privacy is being redefined. And the example I always use is like, for a while I was interviewing people in France, and I'd say, what do you think of Google? And they'd say, I hate the Google. And so, okay, what search engine do you use? Well, you know the answer there. 80% of them use Google. In fact, the European Union tried to create a alternative to Google as a search engine. I think it was called Quero or something. The only way you can find it today is by Googling it, right? So there's a lesson there we might want to reflect on. Getting to the point about Gutenberg, in some ways, and the movable type created the first information revolution. And it led to really centuries of political turmoil. Hopefully this time will be a little quicker, but the solution to the Gutenberg information revolution was representative democracy, elected parliaments. And now we're in the second information revolution. So I think part of what we're seeing here is a political effect from the internet that I certainly didn't expect when we were doing this. Politics will be more direct, they'll be more immediate, they'll be less hierarchical. What citizens expect from their governments has changed because of the internet, and we haven't quite figured out that Gutenbergian solution, right? So we're at the start of a global conversation that has many more participants than we saw involved 25 years ago. There are some shared values, some shared beliefs, but others that are in sharp contrast with each other. In some ways, this is a debate, and that will probably take years for us to work out. I think the internet is at the center of this. And so it's gone from being, when we all started it, it was, maybe it was on your desktop, if you had a desktop, or it was on your mainframe, right? And you got access in some way. That was 25 years ago. And now it's become the central infrastructure for economics, for security, and for governance. And we're still wrestling with that. That, I think, is going to be the challenge of the next 25 years. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great, and thank you. And yeah, I think Jeff Jarvis, this Gutenberg might be an interesting place to start in the sense that there does seem to be a lot of sort of, maybe not history repeating exactly, but history rhyming or something. And so I think the way forward may be looking at how things have sort of evolved and gone through cycles, because of course human nature hasn't changed as far as I know since Gutenberg, so we can kind of count on that as a constant. Andrew, you can take your mic off mute. Now you've approached the internet as a mathematical curiosity in a number of ways to draw ideas about how it behaves and where it might go. So how's your life right now in quarantine, and what would you tell people about your thoughts about lessons learned and how we might proceed?
Well, I'm conducting my life and doing my job fairly well, largely due to the existence of the internet. So I am a full-time faculty member, and I managed to moderately successfully transition to online education. It's not as effective as in person, but it still sort of works. And this would not have been possible 10 years ago, probably not even 5 years ago, definitely not 20 years ago. So for certain fraction of the population, growing fraction, people involved in this kind of work with ideas, thoughts, and so on, this is a wonderful new world. where we can live and work, even though the physical environment outside is hostile, full of those viruses that might kill us if managed to penetrate, through our walls. So yes, things have definitely changed in that sense. And this I view as part of the general evolution of human society. 25 years ago, at the birthday of the internet, as you characterize it, I was still doing mostly strictly technical work in cryptography, algorithms, and other things at Bell Labs. And I was certainly using networking. I was using the internet, but our top level management at AT&T was telling us, well, this is a kind of a toy for academics and maybe for people who dabbling in pornography and other kinds of things. The real data networking technology is the one we're working on, ATM and so on. Well, that obviously did not come true, but in some sense, it's actually worth thinking about this, because practically everybody knew at that time that data networking was going to be much more significant, was going to bring out information society. We can certainly see it in the writings of people like Vannevar Bush about 70 or 80 years ago, then of course Licklider and others in the 60s. In general, technology, information technology was developing. The issue was, how was it going to be arranged? And the internet just happened to be, as somebody kind of described it, kind of a lab experiment that escaped and took over like the coronavirus. Kind of spread all over the world, often in spite of the actions of various authorities, such as my top level bosses 25 years ago, who just thought it as being subversive and not offering all those nice controlled environments that they could manage for their own benefit as well as that of the world. So in some sense, the fact that it's the internet that we're relying upon is sort of an accident. Had ARPA not funded the development of the ARPANET and so on, had the telcos managed to win and have ATM become the dominant networking technology, my guess is that things would have developed fairly similarly, slowly, much more slowly. Again, it would have been much more resistance, much less opportunity for spontaneous action from various people. So be much more control. But still, simply because technology was developing, society was getting more complicated, more interconnected, there's going to be greater flow of information. And we observe this is what brought around Gutenberg. Gutenberg did not just come totally out of the blue. There was a growing volume of information being produced in the 13th, 14th, 15th century. And there was a need, and there were actually other competitors to Gutenberg who were working on other methods. Just Gutenberg happened to be the first one to come out with practical technique. And then afterwards, subsequent centuries, other technologies came up. And so we are where we are right now. Again, we have to be thankful to all those pioneers who worked so hard to develop these things. But again, it's part of a general stream. Now, of course, what's going to happen in the future? Well, as several of the folks already mentioned, there are these conflicting tendencies. There are lots of people who are very kind of upset about these developments. Various governments would like to have more control. Various organizations would have like to have much more control. We certainly see it in, well, China is pushing development of new replacement for the internet. Huawei and so on is participating in it. But some of those changes are already taking place. You can observe it with the development of the greater control by the platform companies, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, and so on, who are kind of developing their platforms. They are building out the data centers close to the edges. They are relegating the ISPs, the telcos, to a subsidiary role, just bit carriers. And again, how it's going to be developed, it's very hard to tell. But it's pretty clear that, yes, this is a new kind of infrastructure. We are moving towards a new world where information matters much more, which of course means that these things about post-truth world are going to become much more prominent. Kind of deep fakes and everything else, they're becoming so much easier to produce. We're moving further away from contact with the real world and so on, that people can now let their imaginations roam, and they can engage also in developing things that are going to manipulate the perceptions of other people and create various political and other movements. So it'll be fascinating to watch. It's very hard to predict. I think, who was it, Jeff or Tom mentioned, that might be even his students might be too old to see the future. We simply have to create the future, and we'll live, hopefully we'll live to see how it develops.
Thank you, Andrew. And Gary, you could take your mic off mute. And I think, one point one thread that we can just hold on to is that with technology, human nature doesn't change, but technology is constantly changing and constantly unfolding. So there really isn't and can't be a status quo, a defendable status quo, even if it may seem like it at a given moment. And Gary, you have probably the broadest span of a view of technology and what companies are trying to do, and of anyone. And so, what's on your list of advice for people and your sense of what's next?
So I had the Consumer Technology Association, which has had different names, but we're best known for producing the CES, which is a big event in Las Vegas every January. We represent over 2,000 technology companies. And when I started out in 1979 as a student, working for a consultant to the organization, we had just a handful of companies making TV sets and radios and phonographs. So yeah, I've seen a lot change since I joined the organization after being their outside lawyer for a while. But in terms of what I see as the internet, to me, it's in the span of human history, it's one of the great tools that were been invented, or if we didn't invent fire, but that's among the first that we managed to figure out what to do with. And whether it's the fire or the hammer or the wheel, or the printing press, or radio or television, or cars or planes. These are all things which are just tools. And when I hear the discussion going on, as I'm often talking to governments about how we have to do this to it and this to it, it's bad or it's good. It's not really bad or good. Tools are not bad or good. They're a vehicle to do something else. And the frustration I have sometimes is the attempt to regulate the tool rather than regulate the user of the tool, and say certain things are good and they're good for society, but certain things are obviously bad for society. You can think of the hammer. I mean, there's not a lot of regulation around hammers because, they make houses, but they also can be used to kill and hurt people. And that's just a fact. So, or you look at fire. Fire is obviously good. It allowed us to live longer, to eat, to preserve food, to stay warm, all these great things, but also destroys things if it's used improperly. And those are things we're still dealing with today. And you come up with things like fire codes and how you build things, but you don't say that fire itself is illegal, except in certain areas where safety is more significant. So when we look at all these things, and I would put in that, given the times, not only, one of the great inventions was indoor plumbing in the toilet. And now after the last couple months, I would also say toilet paper is up there as a great invention too, because I went through 10 stores to try to find some a few weeks ago. But what has it done, the internet? Well, it's created a phenomenal amount of wealth, and it's changed the world. So the poorest person, or some of the poorest people, I shouldn't say still really poor people don't have access to the internet, but I'd say at this point, most of the earth does, most of the people. And that's allowed them to access information and entertainment and education in a way that only wealthy people maybe did a few years ago, but nobody did like 25, 30 years ago. So that's a huge change in one generation. And what the internet has given us is an equalization, in a sense, of access around the world. And that's produced businesses, it's produced the ability to get market prices, its ability to connect us, to learn, to do all sorts of things. We're still at the infancy. I think 25 years is probably good, but we're talking about the lifespan of not just of humans, but of the world history. And we have so much further to go, which is why I think what we do and what we focus on is really important. So my group actually focuses on innovation as something that's extremely important for the betterment of human beings. And when you see the suffering around the world, when you see whether basic things like food, access, water, clean air, things like that, that's just not considered a fundamental human right. And you realize that information and knowledge that could be spread through the internet could solve these things. It's really important. You look at healthcare, I mean, this is something where the internet combined with AI and sensing devices is going to do remarkably well in solving fundamental human problems. But the thing about the internet is you have to have access to it. You have to make it sure so it can be used. And when I remember at the beginning of the internet, we had this great debate between the existing distribution network and the new internet, the Amazons of the world. Should there be an internet sales tax, which seemed very vocal at the time. And we were against an internet sales tax. We said, this is a new technology. We always favor the new thing. We favor innovation just as a fundamental organizational prerequisite. But that was a big battle. And we came down in favor against internet sales tax. But eventually, when there was equalization, there was issues and governments running out of money, we switched. The other one we're kind of engaged in now that I think is still relevant to debate is what kind of freedom you have on the internet. The ability to protect speech on the internet and not hold the provider of a service responsible, the so-called Section 230 protection, has really come under fire for competitive purposes. Those that are not in companies, and this is what the tech industry is doing to itself, it's firing itself. People claiming, they're raising concerns about child pornography and sexual trafficking, which all the facts indicate are not that relevant to this discussion. And it's become a competitive issue where those that are not part of providing information and a service with content where others post information is something where they're saying we have to regulate this, Congress do it. And it's a big subterfuge being fought between a whole bunch of well-meaning people and some very sophisticated lobbyists and companies that are trying to hijack 230. So what we've tried to do is just to reward good behavior and recognize it and call it out and go the other way as well. So we started measuring states on how innovation friendly they are. And one of the criteria we used was what kind of broadband speeds you have, how welcome you are to new business models. Most of them are based on the internet, whether it was things like Airbnb or Lyft and Uber, other services like that. And then there's other technologies we're engaged with: robotics, artificial intelligence, drones, self-driving cars, all new technologies which are, in a sense, use the backbone of the internet in large part to work, but they use many other good things have to happen. But the other thing we do is we started looking at the rest of the world, and we started trying to figure out what's going on in the world and how they're treating the internet. And what we looked at was we issued something which ended up being a little controversial, but we tried to be transparent and say, this is what we're doing. If you don't like us, next version, maybe we'll change, just tell us. And we started ranking the countries in the world by how innovation friendly they are. And one of the things we looked at was not only broadband speeds and cost, but we also looked at whether you allow freedoms. And we define freedoms as the freedoms of the Western world, which is who we are. Do you have the freedom to speak your mind? Do you have the freedom to challenge your government? Do you have the freedom to marry? Do you have the freedom to be free of discrimination based on physical characteristics? Do you have the freedom to marry? But another one we added to that was, do you have the freedom to access the internet? And to me, that's one of the defining things between a good country and a country that's scared of its own citizens, if you will. And obviously, China has tried to build a great wall around the internet. They've tried to build a great wall around cloud structures. And they're doing something because someone mentioned privacy. And the next big battleground, which is connected to the internet, though, is in artificial intelligence. Obviously, we've talked, it's just not about connecting people. It's connecting people and things with things. And artificial intelligence is a big part of that. And part of the growth in artificial intelligence and Internet of Things has to do with the fact that, we're selling billions of phones. They have sensing devices in them. They cost almost nothing. And smart people are creating clever ideas to put them together. But what we see now is we see three different worlds emerging. And to me, it's a battle for artificial intelligence and who is going to, and it is a battle. I know some people think it's not, and we're all one happy world, but there is, because there's a values battle that's part of it. Now you have China, which doesn't allow their citizens to access the internet. It's very difficult to get. As every year I go there, it's more and more difficult to get outside news sources. That look what happened with the COVID virus and why it spread. You could directly attribute it to, basically stopping a doctor, an ophthalmologist, from talking about it on social media. He was pulled aside. He was said, you can't do this on social media. China's gone to social media rankings now, where everyone, by the end of next year, they say will be ranked based on whether they're a good corporate citizen, mostly based on their social media, what they post, who they talk to, whether they post with lower people. That will determine where they are in dating sites, whether they're allowed to travel, what kind of hotel room they get, what kind of job they're eligible for. And China's gone one way with freedoms, and you could argue that, at least until recently, that they've done a good job because most of their 1.4 billion people are eating. They've advanced with technology. But now you see the downside of that type of top-down hierarchy, shutting down the internet, is you've unleashed a virus on the world, and it could have been stopped in a more transparent society. It could have been stopped earlier. But China, in terms of artificial intelligence, has no real privacy. They have access to data sets, and I've talked to a whole bunch of medical school and doctor people in the last few years about it. They're doing things with the data sets in the millions about people, and we're struggling to get a few hundred people into a test, and we have all these things going back to HIPAA, going back to our concepts of privacy. So China is great data sets, great privacy, focus on artificial intelligence, use of the internet. And then there's Europe, which goes exactly the opposite way until recently because of the virus. It's all been about privacy, nothing about innovation. There's not a lot of innovation that's come from China, not a lot in the internet. Name an internet company in China. I mean, you could come up with a couple that have maybe moved here, music service or two, but they've moved to the United States. And why is that? Well, then the US has a different view, and that is all these freedoms we talk about and a more reasonable view on privacy, where there's a trade-off between privacy and health and safety. We're seeing that now being debated in the contact tracing and things like that, which obviously China has been much better at than we have been, or has Europe has been. But those are the battles that are being fought out. We have these innovation scorecards, and we're scoring different countries. We're trying to make sure that we have the opportunity to advance mankind through innovation across borders using the internet. And the next big thing, I think, will be what's the opportunity here that we have that we really have to focus on going forward. And that is making sure, and nothing is clear, even with my own staff. We're all working at home. We have 200 employees, that there are internet haves and have-nots. Ironically, one of my top people is in Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and he's basically has to use a telephone. And you can get a little scratchy picture of his video because he's an internet have-not living in one of the wealthiest places in Washington. And one of our employees lives in a rural area in Virginia. We could barely see him. He's using satellite internet. But there are internet haves and have-nots. I gave two examples of people which are obviously not poor, but we know around the world, in our own country, there's definitely people, and this is putting it forth. It's putting it forth because we see kids in school that need access now, they know that, and they don't have it. We see it with medicine now. We've shifted more dramatically than ever to telemedicine, and we're seeing that some people could benefit from it and some people can't. Obviously, that's not good for all doctors. So teledoc and other services have just jumped out of nowhere. And we're seeing it in telework. So certainly it depends where you live, whether you're a good teleworker or not. We're seeing certainly major shifts in education at the university level. We're going to see shifts in society as people move forward, and this has become a habit of working remotely, learning remotely, being taken care of healthy remotely. And what do we need to make that happen, to make that next big shift? Well, obviously, I don't want to beat it to death, but it's 5G. We're filing comments, I believe.
So, Gary, I'm going to let Esther fill out the innovation points, but we can follow up. Did you have sort of a closing thought? I mean,
the
5G.
5G, and there's a technology we're supporting at the FCC within a week, focus on Microsoft's proposal to use the TV white spaces, so you can get that signal out there, so you can get full bandwidth, so we could solve some of the problems we've had of fading people on Zoom calls and kids that can't get the education over broadband that they need.
Excellent. And well, you mentioned at the beginning innovation, and I think in your journey since 1979, that has been a theme. Innovation, I think, is also Esther Dyson's middle name. And she, from another direction in terms of starting companies and focusing on healthcare these days. I don't know if you, Esther, I mean, you've maybe had several careers of doing, different aspects around the internet, and maybe even have devices now that should be at Consumer Electronics Show. But go ahead and just give us your perspective on where we are.
Okay, and I'll try and debrief because I really would love to have some back and forth conversation. I got started in this thing as first a journalist asking questions, then somebody who had a conference about the industry and got involved in a whole lot of things. I was the founding chairman of ICANN, which is having its own little challenges now with ISOC and .org and so forth. But the two things I'd like to talk about. One, I wrote a book just a few years before this. I think it was 1996 or something. And I was kind of hopeful that people would get educated and understand the issues around privacy and so forth. And honestly, I was really disappointed. Nobody ever noticed anything. And then, finally it all blew up with Facebook a few years ago. But to the extent the internet has problems, it's just the medium. The problem is the people. And it's an amazing technology, but it hasn't really solved any of the world's great problems. It's, in a sense, somebody mentioned it, but it's created a world that is more and more friction free. And when you have no friction and no inertia, things become more and more volatile, as we're seeing right now in the stock market and in so many other places. The difference between rich and poor was severe, but it was different when the rich and the poor fundamentally had to live together. Now, people are neatly put away. Sorry, whether it's in different countries or in different parts of town or different parts of the country. There's this sort of global elite that thinks it's totally connected over the internet. And then there are all these people stuck in place we have tech debt on the internet and in business. And I would say that the world has health debt. All these people have pre-existing conditions. They're diabetic and they have coughs. Hold on. They're diabetic and they have other kinds of diseases that make them far more vulnerable to coronavirus. And in a sense, there's some kind of information debt, which makes people much more vulnerable to information because they're cynical and don't trust anybody. And so we've got this world that's moving ever faster, no friction. You could call that government control or civil society or whatever, but it's hard to see what's going to happen. And my hope is to some extent that this coronavirus thing ends up being a bit of a disruptive reset and makes people start to think a little more about how they build the fundamental infrastructure of public education and health and a society that doesn't cram 20 people into a boarding house so that they all get sick. The other point I wanted to make was one that just actually came to me as I was listening. Another part of what I wrote about was the attention economy. This notion of you're trying to get people's attention ultimately in order to sell them something. And I kept thinking, well, you can only get attention right now is interestingly being dispersed because there's probably 29 different Zoom calls each of us could be on right now. And it's driving me crazy. But anyway, just as we've got this derivatives financial market where people trade more financial instruments than there actually is economic activity. And so you've created this kind of superstructure. It also happened in real estate that comes crashing down when somebody pulls the plug on the balloon. I think we actually are selling more attention. We're creating more influencers and more people going on Zoom calls and giving their talks and getting attention than the fundamental economic activity that they're supposed to be supporting is actually going to support. And I don't know what happens there, but I think we've got a bubble in attention right now, just as we might have a bubble in financial instruments. And that's an inherently internet-based bubble. It's not just the stock market bubble, but this bubble in all these influencers influencing all these people, but they're not actually able to spend as much money as the influencers are making influencing them. So
Okay, thank you. And I'm gonna, and Tom, we'll move to you next, just to sort of bring us out on a topic that you hinted at, that Esther is picking up on as well, and Gary mentioned about toilet paper. Just a quick story about the toilet paper. Apparently, there's two supply chains for toilet paper, and there really wasn't hoarding. The problem was that the consumer supply chain was meant for you to be at work. And when you were at home all the time, they didn't have enough for you to be going to the bathroom at home all the time. And so Tom, you and the two chains apparently are so separate and so refined that they couldn't, these big gigantic rolls of toilet paper you have in a commercial context didn't work at home. And Tom, go ahead off your mute and just talk to us a little about your concern about the fragility of supply chains, that we've actually used the internet to thin out and make more efficient. But one of the problems of having a super efficient supply chain is you're making them more vulnerable.
Yeah, I think that in a way, the internet, as it's matured, is a victim of its own success. Back years ago, when we fought the UN to bring down the price of telephone calls from $1.50 a minute to China to a penny a minute or less, we were exhibiting how fragile that infrastructure that had been put together in an oligarchic sense really was. Because the internet let us get to some key leverage points and sort of bypass the toll booths, and down went the balloon. But as the internet has grown, as the internet has become successful, then powerful entities have grown on the internet as well. We were good guys, not because we were really good guys, but because we were all little guys. But now some of us aren't little guys anymore, and it's human nature to want to hold on to power when you have power. And so I think that we're ripe for being disrupted. And I mean that in a positive way. Certainly not disrupted by regulation. I think it's a terrible and a dangerous trend toward censoring the internet, even though there are obviously some bad things that happen without censorship. I agree with a lot that Jeff writes. But I think one speculation about what this upset may be, the internet enabled the kind of globalization that wasn't there before. The cheap telephone calls are just one symptom of that, but almost frictionless, as Esther was saying, communication everywhere in the world. And so we did enable some good things about globalization and transcending locality. Now I think it's time for the internet, and I think it's beginning to happen, to strengthen locality. If only one person in each town was on the internet, then of course the internet was used for global purposes. But with everybody on it, we're seeing, and Jeff, you've written about this, that local media, for example, is springing up in enormous importance. Here in Vermont, during the COVID crisis, people spending more time on local media, which is mainly nonprofit, was afraid their donations would dry up. Instead, they increased because people were so needed this local media, but this was all internet-based local media. This wasn't the printing press that was saved. The Connect press is almost silent.
So Tom, I'm going to take us through a lightning round at this point, talking essentially, let's just everybody sort of some final words about the supply chain and how it's affects. So Jeff Jarvis, essentially the news supply chain was disrupted. And so we kind of need to figure out another news supply chain. What do you think about that in terms of your world?
The house was on fire. Corona just threw gas on it. I think that the problem is that we brought the old mass media business model into the internet, and what the internet really kills is the idea of the mass. It was always an insult. It was always wrong. We've always been individuals, and so the news infrastructure was set up on an attention marketplace, which leads us to cats and Kardashians, then a subscription marketplace, which takes us back to the handwritten, expensive newsletters before newspapers, and we haven't rebuilt and rethought the business models fundamentally. I think that where we go, Tom is right. I love local, but I was very wrong that I thought hyperlocal blogs would be a building block for the future. I was dreaming. But I do think that there are mechanisms wherein we can enable communities to share what they know. That's what the internet is built to do.
And James Lewis, you could take your mic off mute. So you've been, your global perspective, but maybe what you're seeing is sort of the assertion of local perspectives, even down to the individual. So I presume this experiment with surveillance that China is going after, I think Gary talked about it a bit, there's some optimism about the people in control that they can control individual humans. So do you think this sort of localism question is in play?
No, I think you can have both trends going on at the same time. And that's what we're seeing is people love global connectivity, they love seeing what other people are up to, but there's also been an increased value placed on national activities, national culture. And so in some ways you've got the two things going on simultaneously, not usually in the same people, but we're it's not so much a race as it is, which channel are you in? When you look at India, for example, maybe a better story to look at, globally connected, very aware, but also very, very proud of their traditions and thinking of ways to protect it. So you've got this tension here, and it's not necessarily bad, but I think local is accompanied by maybe not the way when Esther was chair of ICANN, we thought there would be this one global society. That might be not so much going away, but now being accompanied by a greater assertion of the local identity. So it's both at the same time, which makes it a little more confusing.
Yes, and Andrew, you and I have talked in the past about the internet being shaped with network effects, that it's pretty hard to find, resist the network effects in creating a Facebook or a Twitter. How do you see sort of the effects on, economies of scale that are accomplished in supply chains? I mean, do you see some different forces in play there?
Oh, absolutely. But again, they are conflicting ones, and it's not clear how it's going to work out. Just look what's happening today. The economy is kind of in a deep recession, if not in a depression. The companies that are doing pretty well are the big platform companies, Amazon primarily, but also to an extent, say Microsoft and Google and so on. There are huge network effects. And so, yes, people are talking about how we need to bring in more locality. And of course, locality has always mattered. The kind of illusion of depth of distance of world is flat was always an illusion. But still, there are these economic and technological forces which are kind of very powerfully influencing the world towards maintaining global connectivity and exploiting network effects. Absolutely. And precisely how it's going to work out, it's hard to tell, because as I think several of the panelists mentioned, technology is there, but how society uses it, that's very hard to predict.
Right. And so, Gary, I'm going to get your last thoughts. And so as you observed how the consumer electronics ecosystem proceeds, I mean, you've seen things bubble up from innovation, and the innovation doesn't necessarily come from the economy of scale players. And I guess you're saying to us that as long as you protect innovation, that process will continue.
Right. I think it comes from everyone. And we've always taken that position that it's the smallest company where someone has a good idea that has to be exposed. But like there's frankly, a crazy idea circulating now by a senator and a congressman. They want to stop all acquisitions by the big companies. Well, who's that going to hurt? Is it going to hurt the big companies, or is it going to hurt the small companies and choke off investment? I mean, it's those type of things don't make sense. So, look, big companies have the role, small companies have the role. Obviously I'm Switzerland, but I believe it too. I just think that we have big companies have the resources to do the really, really big things and make the investments. But we got to keep the investment flow going to the economy so smaller players can start something. The internet, I think I'm a little more optimistic than Esther is. I think that I think we have solved some major world problems with the internet. And when I look at what we're doing and where we're going, I'm really bullish on it. I just don't want us to screw it up. And the way we could screw it up is to overregulate, dampen the innovative spirit, choke off investment, and make some bad moves where all of a sudden internet companies are liable for things they shouldn't be liable for.
Thanks. And Esther, we're going to give you the last word.
Okay.
We have 2 minutes left.
Yeah.
But again, you've seen different internets, right? I mean, over your career, you saw the internet when it had, what, 1 million people on it or something?
I saw it before it existed.
Right, before it existed.
Yeah.
And so you must have seen all kinds of things play out. I mean, what's your sense about, I mean, are you, well, anyway, that eventually things will change for the better?
I'll just, I don't want to answer a specific question. I want to go back to what Jeff Jarvis said, because I do think, I mean, fundamentally, the internet is about information, whether it's business, it's structured, unstructured, people talking to lots of people, lovers talking one by one and maybe being listened to by the Chinese censors. But anyway, the thing we're missing is basically this whole supply chain integrity thing. And, you know, where's the information coming from? People are starting to ask, where's my food coming from? Where, you know, who made this dress? Was child labor involved? And this whole notion that, I mean, the biggest thing the internet companies have done is completely ignore the responsibility they have to guarantee the integrity of what it is they're serving. When I go to, you know, old-fashioned retail store and they have some little nook where they're selling some branded jeans, I'm expecting them to understand who that vendor is that's selling the branded jeans. And when I go on the internet, I get ads from all these suspicious people, and I get news that comes from sources that haven't been, you know, there are limits, but at the same time, I think the internet platforms do have the obligation to the public to check the integrity of their supply chains.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank my speakers and the Internet Society of DC for hosting our webcast, and Jolie McFay for doing the technical connecting the dots. Thank you. And with that, we'll see you in 5 years. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
That was great.
Thanks.
Wonderful to see all of you guys.
Good to see all of you.
Nice seeing you. Bye.
So long.